Good morning. My name is Maya Miguel, Senior Executive Director for Foundation Relations and Founding Executive Director for the FIU Foundation Office of Inclusive Philanthropy. Thank you for joining us this morning. Before I proceed, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the grief that so many of us carry as we learned of another senseless shooting that took place on May 24th, resulting in the deaths of 21 individuals, including 19 children at Robb Elementary School in Texas. We continue to see unspeakable violence across our nation. It is my hope and also sincere prayer that we will all be compelled to action. Please join me in a moment of silence in honor and recognition of the lives lost. Thank you. In honor of Jewish American Heritage Month, the FIU Foundation Office of Inclusive Philanthropy is pleased to collaborate with FIU's Center for Humanities and the Urban Environment to present more to the story, Jewish diversities in race, religion, and culture. Our panelists for this morning's virtual roundtable are Susan Gladstone Pasternak, Executive Director for the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU. Susan brings more than 30 years of executive experience at the national and global levels and has served in several prominent leadership positions in the US and abroad, most recently as Director of Development for the museum and for all of FIU's Jewish strategic initiatives, including the university's Global Jewish Studies program, Holocaust Studies, and Hillel FIU. Also joining us from the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU, is Luna Goldberg. Luna is the recipient of a Wavemaker Grant, a Fulbright Fellowship to Israel, and served as the curatorial research assistant for the Israeli Pavilion at the 57th Venice Biennale. Luna has created exhibitions and programs in partnership with the University of California, Berkeley, Detroit Art Week, the College Art Association, and has held positions at the Norton Museum of Art, the museum at Eldridge Street, and the Sullivan Galleries, among others. Our third panelist is the esteemed Dr. Oren Stier, Director of the Holocaust and Genocide Studies Program and Professor of Religious Studies at the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs at FIU, where he directs the Jewish Studies Certificate Program. Dr. Stier has been a Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies Fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and in 2020-2021, he served on a Florida Department of Education expert group, writing new statewide standards for Holocaust education. Joining us from Paris is FIU alumnus Beko Littman. Beko is an experienced facilitator, educator, and speaker who is dedicated to making organizations' culture more unified and more authentic at its core. Beko leads transformative conversations on race, religion, gender identity, and sexual orientation in the workplace and beyond. He uses his unique skill set and lived experience as Black, gay, and Jewish to help organizations and communities create more inclusive and diverse cultures. I am going to figure out a way to host an alumni dinner in Paris. We guarantee that. Our moderator, Dr. Erica Friedman, serves as the Associate Director of FIU's Pride Center and Interim Director of FIU's Women's Center, which is part of the Office of Social Justice and Inclusion. There will be time for questions and answers towards the end of the roundtable. Please be sure to leave your Q&A in the box at the bottom of the screen. Erica, turning it over to you.
Hello, good morning. On behalf of the Office of Social Justice and Inclusion, I am honored to be here today to moderate this panel with my colleagues. I don't often have the opportunity to activate the culturally Jewish part of my identity, so thank you very much for having me, and thank you, Maya, for the introduction. Individuals shape their understanding of themselves and their place in society, which is mostly defined by their local and larger communities. What comprises Jewishness? Is it nationality? Is it a race, a religion, an ethnicity? We recognize that the answers to these questions are constantly shifting. To start things off, I want to pose to our panelists today just a simple question. What does Jewishness mean to you personally? And anybody can start off with this one, so I pitch it to all of you.
Thank you, Erica. I think for me, Judaism and Jewishness, it's a value system. It's how I build community. It's something that's always changing, but it's always something comfortable.
Go ahead, Susan. Turn on your mic.
I'm muted, I'm sorry. For me, my Jewishness is just a core part of my identity. I'm a woman, I'm an American, I'm a Floridian, I'm a mother, I'm a grandmother, I'm a Jew. It's just part of the core basis of who I am, where I came from, where my ancestors came from. And in any description of myself where it would be appropriate, I would include it as part of my description of myself.
Thank you.
May I? So like Susan, my Judaism is a central part of who I am. It's one of a significant identifier for sure. But when I think about my Jewishness, I immediately think about ritual. So for me, Shabbat, for instance, it's so significant. And it's a way for both me and my husband to connect to our religion and to Jews. It feels very comfortable and it brings us a lot of joy. I also think about music. And more importantly, I think about Tikkun Olam, this idea of making the world a better place. That's very significant for me as a Jew. Thanks.
I guess I'm last. So, I think my Jewishness is, like Susan, a core part of my identity, but I think even more so, it's really the lens through which I see the world and the lens through which I experience the world. And it frames my time and my space, my days and my weeks and my years. And who I am in the world is impossible to dissociate really from my Jewishness and my Jewish identity, and how I interact with others, how I relate to the world and people in it and institutions in it is definitely framed by my Jewishness as well.
Thank you all for that. Everybody had a kind of different answer, and I just wanted to highlight that how people relate differently to their identities, even when they are the same label. We talk a lot about that in the Office of Social Justice and Inclusion when engaging with the different communities that we engage with. And I know personally, I have a completely different iteration of how I relate to my Jewishness. And for me, it's very connected to family and history, especially history. And then what Oren said, the kind of lens through which I see the world based on that. So I'm going to direct this one to Oren, but anybody can answer as well. Given the increase in anti-Semitic attacks in recent years, coupled with declining knowledge, especially among young people, about the Holocaust, what are your concerns about Jewish identity and Holocaust awareness in particular in the 21st century?
Oh, thanks for that question. So, I think the issue is really complex, and for me, I think it's important to approach it in some context. So I would start with Charlottesville in August of 2017, the Unite the Right rally, neo-Nazis marching in the streets, yelling blood and soil, yelling Jews will not replace us. The so-called replacement theory that received a fair amount of play in recent years, unfortunately, in the media. I heard Timothy Snyder, the historian, the Yale historian, talk about this particular issue a few months ago, and he said something so fascinating. He said that chanting a slogan, Jews will not replace us, is already buying into an anti-Semitic worldview, right? Because there aren't enough Jews in the world, even if you take all of us and put them together, you know. So it already has that assumption that there is some kind of conspiracy, that there's something going on, right? And you have to read it in that way. And then I would also cite Pittsburgh and the Tree of Life synagogue shooting in October 2018. And its particular attacks against Jews, but the shooter's manifesto, and we have to take manifestos with a huge grain of salt, but the manifesto saying that there was this concern about Jews bringing in invaders, right? The HIAS connection, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and the Jews being involved in bringing in invaders who, again, they're going to somehow replace, they're threatening a white majoritarian way of life, as it were. So, you know, anti-Semitism has been on the rise these last few years and longer, but also I think it's coupled with a kind of white anxiety. It's a real anxiety about the future of majority culture, right? When is the population going to turn and become, when are we going to become a majority minority country? And this is, I think, a real social cultural anxiety about it. So surveys definitely show an increase in anti-Semitism as well as lack of knowledge of the Holocaust. We had the Claims Conference survey in 2018, and then the update, the state version in 2020. There was a Pew survey in 2019. And all of these surveys point to an increasing lack of knowledge, both in specific facts about the Holocaust and also just general conceptual understanding. And it gets worse as people get younger. So as these younger generations grow up, become adults, become integral members of society, this is a real concern because there's very little understanding of what the Holocaust was. My concerns, therefore, are that Jews are increasingly isolated. You know, the right often says that Jews are not white enough, right? Whereas the left often says that Jews are too white, right? Jews are like, we've become part of this majoritarian culture, and so we can't claim victimhood, right? We can't claim any mantle of suffering or anything anymore. So I'm concerned about this political isolation. I'm concerned about increasing scapegoating. Any bad thing that happens in the world, including COVID, is blamed on Jews. And I'm concerned about the gaslighting, about a lot of people today kind of saying, oh, you know, there's no problem with anti-Semitism. Like, Jews are completely integrated into society. It's not like, it's not there. What you're experiencing is not real, right? And so these are my concerns. I think the fix is, it's not rocket science, it's education. You know, it's making sure that people are educated more about the Holocaust. And also what surveys and studies have shown is that people who know Jews know more, and they connect, they understand the Holocaust better, they understand anti-Semitism better, and they're better equipped to kind of manage this relationship. So I think I'll leave it with that.
I just want to make one follow-up comment to what Warren said, which is this specifically related to the scapegoating. This goes back centuries and centuries and centuries throughout history. Here we are in 2022, and we're still facing the same thing that our ancestors faced, you know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago.
That's what happens to any minority group. I don't think it's necessarily unique to Jewish people that scapegoating happens, but it certainly has happened historically for a very long time to Jewish people. So another question, kind of going on current events here. In January of this year, a school board in Tennessee banned Mouse, a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel about the Holocaust. Whoopi Goldberg's comments on the TV show The View in which she declared that the Holocaust is not about race, drew a lot of backlash. Later, she apologized, but her comments were certainly an important lesson about how race is thought of differently in different communities. So what does the banning of Mouse and Whoopi Goldberg's response to it tell us about this kind of questions of Jews and race, or the racialization of people? Yeah, with the easy ones this morning.
I'd be happy to talk about that. Susan, did you want to say something first? Oh, you went out again.
I was just asking if that question was directed to one of us in particular to start.
It's to all of you. Anyone can
Okay.
answer that one.
Go ahead, Warren.
So, I mean, this was just a very interesting case. And I think it says a lot about perceptions regarding Jews and race. Mouse itself says a lot about, about Jews and race. And so it's, a fascinating topic for discussion. I want to point out that Whoopi Goldberg apologized immediately and repeatedly. And I don't think the issue was handled very well by, I think it's ABC that the show is on. So, I actually brought up a clip that I think we could watch in just a moment, just to give people the context for the discussion. But I do think it's a very revealing discussion about the state of perception of Jews and the relationship to Jews and race in the Holocaust that I think is important to talk about. So could we have that clip?
Well, also, if you're going to do this, then let's be truthful about it, because the Holocaust isn't about race. No, it's not about race.
Ethnicity.
It's,
Well,
no, it's
Jews
about
a different race.
But it's not about race. It's not about race.
What is it about?
Because it's about man's inhumanity to man. That's what it's about.
But it's about white supremacy. It's
Well,
about
but
going
it's not-
after
it's
Jews
not about
and
race.
gypsies and
But these are two
Romas.
white groups of people.
Well, they
How
go
do we
after black
They
but
people
didn't see
too.
them as white.
And they were
But you're
after
missing the
homosexuals.
point. You're
Yeah.
missing the point. The
Yeah.
minute you turn it into race, it goes down this alley. Let's talk about it for what it is. It's how people treat each other. It's a problem. It doesn't matter if you're black or white, because black, white, Jews, everybody eats each other. So is it, if you're uncomfortable, if you hear about Mouse, should you be worried? Should your child say, oh my God, I wonder if that's me? No, that's not what they're gonna say. They're gonna say, I don't wanna be like that.
Well, hopefully.
I want to be cruel.
Yeah,
And
well, yeah, most kids, they don't want to be cruel.
No, they don't.
And we're living in an era where people are comparing vaccine cards to the yellow stars, where people are comparing vaccinations to what Anne Frank went through.
Yeah.
So it is necessary for kids to learn about
They
the
have
Holocaust.
by the way,
Learn about man's inhumanity to man, however it exposes itself. I have to cut you off.
I just want to say that
Fast.
Mouse was banned and it flew to top 20 of Amazon's rules last week.
So, I think there's a lot in there. Mouse, for those of you who are not familiar with it, and if you're not familiar with it, you need to run out and buy it and read it immediately. It's not a graphic novel, although everybody describes it as that. It is a combination memoir, biography, and autobiography by the author Art Spiegelman, who's a comic artist, about his relationship to his father, Vladek Spiegelman, who was a Holocaust survivor, and other family members and other relationships. And the convention in it, it's drawn in comics form. The convention he uses animal heads on human bodies to represent different ethnic groups in the Holocaust. So, Jews are mice, and Germans are cats. Americans are dogs. It goes on and on. It's French are frogs. I mean, there's some Poles are pigs. There was a lot going on there that offended a lot of people across the board in these representations. And that, the book itself puts out there questions about racial identity, right? And about what is race and how do people recognize race and where is race? And I just think that what came out of Whoopi Goldberg's comments was fascinating because, one, it reflects her own very personal experience of race. right? A lot of people were criticizing her for getting it wrong, and that's another issue. But the fact that what she says, you know, the Holocaust is not about race, because she's saying race is about blackness, and this is not like Jews and blackness. There is no, they're on two different planes, really, right? And also it reflects, I think, the success of an educational program that the Holocaust is universal, right? So successful, in fact, that she said, you know, the Holocaust is not about race, it's about man's inhumanity to man. Like there's that phrase that's been drilled into people so much that, you know, I don't know how much she knows about the specific attack on Jews and Judaism and Jewish culture that was the Holocaust, but she does know that it was bad, right? That it was about people being bad to other people. So we can't completely condemn her, but it does reveal a lot about kind of the impoverished nature of public understanding of the Holocaust. And I think also the very complicated public nature of the understanding of race.
Orion,
Go ahead, Luna.
Thank you. I want to talk about something that you brought up, which is education, and especially living in this moment, you know, looking at the Jewish Museum. I oversee our education department and also K through 12 at the Wolfsonian. And we're living in this moment where both in Florida, but also across the nation, critical race theory is being challenged, and math textbooks are being banned from schools or not approved. Over 52 textbooks this year were, and they're math textbooks because of the types of examples that are included in them. And so the question that I have is, you know, how do we continue to move forward and do this work when these topics are under attack? My approach is always to deal with history itself, to deal with facts, and really lead students to connect the dots. But it is something that's becoming a huge issue nationally.
Yeah, can I jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Baker, I
It's
have a follow-up question for you too. So go right in.
A lot of good stuff here. You know, it's interesting. So there are a couple of things with the banning of the books. I think what we're seeing is whether it's the replacement theory, critical race theory, and this pushback around diversity and inclusion, it's so dangerous because really what's being said is that you really don't matter and we don't care about your pain. It's an attempt to erase. And I think it's particularly dangerous at a time when, in this case, anti-Semitism is at an all-time high in the United States. In fact, according to the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, I believe in 2020, there were more than 2,000 anti-Semitic attacks around the country. And that's the highest it's been in the 40 years since the ADL started tracking this. And I just think that it's very dangerous. And what I'll say about race and Judaism, you know, it's very nuanced, meaning as Jews, each of us may find different ways of identifying. Some of us, it's religion, some of us are race or ethnicity or national identity. And I think it's important to have those discussions, but oftentimes those who are committing these acts against Jews, for instance, I don't think it's that nuanced. I think oftentimes they don't care, but they definitely see Jews as something less than white, other than white, and it's all an attempt to dehumanize, which it makes it easier, for instance, to implement these laws. So we can't have this sort of education around the Holocaust or raising awareness around anti-Semitism. It's frightening. It's frightening. And like you, Luna, I think that what we have to do is keep pushing forward, stick to the facts, share that history when possible. I think what's challenging is for those educators who are in environments where suddenly they're not permitted to do that. I can't imagine.
I'm going to kind of combine two questions for you, Beko, which is, and this kind of actually builds off of what Luna said was a part of, you know, how you relate to your Jewishness being about, you know, the values factor. It's really about like what values you have. So talk to us, Beko, a little bit about, you know, inclusion being a value of Jewishness And what comprises Jewishness? Sharing a little bit about like Black lives in the Jewish context in particular.
Can you hear me? Yeah, it's a great question. So, wow, inclusion. You know, at a time where I feel like the secular world is grappling with issues of diversity and inclusion and what is it, how do we begin? I feel like as Jews, we have a little bit of an advantage because it's in the Torah, you know, in so many ways. So this idea, for instance, of welcoming the stranger, which is mentioned, I think, more than 30 times in the Torah, because as Jews, we know what it's like to be a stranger in a strange land. We know the dangers of what can happen when we other people. And so I feel like just welcoming the stranger, and when we look at, for instance, this idea of honor and respect and being made in the image of God, you know, how is it that we, or tikkun olam, repairing the world, how do we do all of those good works? How do we adhere to those values and at the same time exclude a group of people based on their gender or race or religion? And the answer is we can't. It's so deeply embedded in, I believe, in who we are as Jews. So for me, it's quite simple. And so when I'm often asked to defend this, I'm like, look at the text, it's there. It's there. But of course, like many things, we all have different interpretation of what those things mean. But for me, the inclusion is, it's an easy one. And when it comes to my Jewishness, I believe the second part of that is about Black lives in the Jewish context. Okay, this one's interesting. So when we're talking about or exploring intersectionality, so in my case, you know, there's my Blackness, my Jewishness, and my gayness. And there's the internal and then the external. Internally, there's no problem. You know, those three things coexist quite happily. There's no problem there. It's really what happens out there. And like so many things, people begin to project their fears and concerns and ideas of what these things mean on to each other. And so in my case, for instance, when I go into a Jewish space, oftentimes it's like, well, are you sure you're in the right place? Wait, you don't look Jewish. Are you sure you're Jewish? Wait, is your mother Jewish? Wait, did you convert through Orthodoxy, like the real way, or are you a Reformed Jew? So wait, what's the most important Jewish holiday? And sometimes this happens within 2 minutes of meeting, right? And I know that for the most part, it's just curiosity. People, they're curious. They want to know because I realize that I don't fit this mold of what a Jew looks like. And I understand that, you know, you have to grow thick skin with these things. And the same thing can happen in the Black community as a Jew. And I'm sorry to say that, unfortunately, that anti-Black racism exists in certain pockets of the Jewish community, and anti-Semitism exists in certain pockets of the Black community, which is why this work is so important to me, to really raise awareness and to help folks understand that we don't have to compete. I think there's something in us as human beings that feels like, well, no, we had more pain because we had the Holocaust, but no, we had slavery, so we don't have to do that. We can accept that oppression and marginalization, these are all bad things, and that it's not my place to challenge someone else's experience. If that's what their experience is, that's what it is. And so I think it's important to respect and to honor that. The last thing I'll say on that is, I think it's important wherever we can. Dr. Steer alluded to this sort of political polarization that we're experiencing right now. And as a result, unfortunately, I feel that we have abandoned critical thinking and we no longer think about effective ways to solve problems. So what I attempt to do in my work is to try to find the common ground. And sometimes we just have to start in those small places. How can we just come together and agree on this and then build from there? So thank you.
Thank you for that. And I always, you know, when I think about this, when I talk about it with other people, I often think about the shared histories that we have and the shared persecution. And I think about that across the context of so many different marginalized groups in history and how we would be so much stronger if we actually came together and work together. So thank you for highlighting those points for us.
May I say something?
Yes, please, go ahead,
Okay.
Susan.
So I just want to emphasize again what both Luna and Beko said about education. It's part of the reason that we have the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU. And so to that end, I'm noticing that a lot of us are throwing out terms that may not be familiar to people who aren't Jewish, like the Torah, like the difference between being an Orthodox Jew or a Reformed Jew. So I would just like to request that if any of us use a vocabulary word that's not familiar, that the audience let us know, and one of us can get back with an answer. Because, you know, Judaism is complicated. I mean, there are Sephardic Jews, there are Ashkenazi Jews, and just looking at us on this panel, you know, my family's from Eastern Europe, Luna's family's from North Africa, you know, they're all different. There's sort of no one thing that compromises the history of a Jew. And so I'm just asking the audience, please feel free to ask us questions. It's something that you haven't heard before.
Yes, thank you, Susan. I appreciate that so much, because I know, you know, a lot of the fear around Jewish people is just the not knowing and understanding. And that's the case with a lot of marginalized groups. And, you know, the more we have education, the better. And so let me follow up then and ask you, can you tell us a little bit about the Jewish Museum of Florida and its special relationship to Jewish American Heritage Month?
Okay, so what is now the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU? It's been part of FIU since 2012. Started as a traveling exhibition created by the founding executive director, Marcia Jo Zarabit. And her idea was that people were not aware of the impact of Jews in her state, which is the state of Florida, all the things that Jews had contributed to the growth of the state beginning in 1763, when the first Jews arrived in Pensacola, actually. So she created this traveling exhibition by going to every single city in the state of Florida and collecting historical information. And eventually, long story, it found a permanent home at the first Orthodox synagogue in Miami Beach. So not the first synagogue in Miami, but the first one in Miami Beach, built in 1929, second building 1936, and that's where it lives now. So it stopped being a place of prayer and it became a place of history and learning. And then it became part of FIU. And I just have to say at this point that I welcome each and every one of you to come for a private tour with me, with Luna, to see what we are showcasing there, so that you can see it with your own eyes, because it's absolutely a spectacular, spectacular building. As part of Marcia's work within the museum, she noticed that there were no states, there was no recognition statewide or nationally of Jewish Heritage Month. That concept was growing in other groups. There was nothing related to Jews. And one could have a lot of discussion about that, back to is Judaism a race or not? But nonetheless, it's her belief that the history of Jews was worthy of having a month of discussion and learning. So she started with Florida Jewish History Month. She worked with State Senator Gwen Margolis. They lobbied, they did a lot of work, and they were able to get Florida Jewish History Month confirmed in 2003. And then she moved on to the state level, working with Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz who brought on board Senator Arlen Specter, and they were able to have Florida Jewish History Month is in January, and then they were able to have May deemed National Jewish History Month, and that happened in 2005. So the whole concept of Jewish National History Month began at the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU. It wouldn't exist if not for the efforts from the museum. And I don't believe there are many other states that have adopted a state Jewish History Month, but National Jewish History Month has become quite a large recognition, celebration, literally all over the United States. So that has really become something quite special, and it all began at our museum.
Very cool. I did not know that. That is really cool history to share. Thank you, Susan. Luna, I believe you actually have a presentation for us to give us a little overview of the museum's history and connecting it to history specifically of discrimination in Miami. Would you like to start that up now?
That would be wonderful. Thank you. So let's go on to the next slide. I don't really have a sense of how many of you have been to the Jewish Museum, but I wanted to start with this image of our building as it looks today, and to give you a sense of the museum because we are so removed from campus. So as Susan mentioned, the Jewish Museum of Florida is comprised of 2 buildings. And what you'll see, the building that we see on the left is actually the original building from 1929. Now, the museum is located in the south of 5th neighborhood. So we're actually located on 3rd and Washington, which I'll talk a little bit more about that later on because there are very specific reasons for that. But if we go to the next slide, we can see one of my favorite images of the museum. And this is an image of the groundbreaking for that second building in 1936. So as I mentioned, the museum is located in the south of 5th neighborhood because at the time, there was a lot of discrimination in Miami, and that history isn't so far removed. So right now we're talking about the 1920s. And there are a few names that you might know in Miami. So for instance, the name Carl Fisher, if you think of Fisher Island, or John Collins, these were 2 of the big developers at the time on Miami Beach. And there were also developers that happened to be anti-Semitic that wouldn't sell property to Jews. Really, the only developers that did at the time were the Loomis brothers. So if you've ever been to Loomis Park on 12th and Washington, the Loomis brothers are the ones that owned a lot of the south of 5th property. And so what we see in this image is really a need for space. You can tell just how crowded the building would have been. This is really the Jewish community coming out, and the year is 1935. So that second building was going to come in. Now, the other image that we see on the right, I always like to have these side by side because there are multiple things that are happening here. On the left, we have this really thriving community. And on the right, we have an advertisement for an apartment or a hotel. And something that was very common at the time were these restrictions. So if you look up top, you can see something that says Gentile clientele. And that was essentially a sign saying that if you were a Jew, if you were a person of color, you could not own property or even stay in these buildings. So that's also a big component of our story. Next slide. Now, when they built this second building, it's quite a beautiful space. And it's interesting because it was designed by an architect named Henry Hohauser. And Henry Hohauser was a big Art Deco architect. He designed over 300 buildings in Miami Beach and also happened to be Jewish himself. And the building really, one of the reasons I'll invite you to come visit is because it blends Jewish iconography with Art Deco styles. And so you can kind of see some of this in this old postcard. Next slide. So here we are. This is the buildings back in the day before we were a museum. And I had mentioned a little bit about these deed restrictions. And so over time, what happened is the community really grew and started to thrive. And I have a few historic images to show you the interior as well. So next slide. Now this is one of the images of the interior of the second building. And like we mentioned, the building was a synagogue. So it was a place where the community would gather. They would come together to pray. They would come together for celebrations. And this is still what the building looks like today. We don't have as many pews, but this continues to help us share our story. Next slide. And this is an image of a celebration. It was a wedding taken, this image is taken in 1948. So this is where things begin to get interesting in Miami. So during World War II, Miami becomes the beach really becomes this Air Force training base. And so a lot of people are coming down to train to become pilots. And that led to an incredible move of over 100,000 Jews to all of Florida. So a lot of these Jews who'd come to learn how to fly later moved back in the 1940s and 50s. I mention this because in 1947, something really wonderful happened. So Miami Beach was actually one of the leaders in passing an anti-bias sign ordinance. And what they do, if we look at the next slides, they were really pushing back against a lot of these images that we see. So there were apartment complexes, again, with the Gentiles only sign, hotel resorts that had signs that said, always a view, never a Jew, and even this Essex House Hotel that had a refined clientele. So in 1947, the city of Miami Beach, with pressure from this wave of Jewish immigrants, Jewish veterans, returning after the war, passes legislation. Next slide. Again, we see this is Belle Isle on the Venetian. So again, restricted clientele. Next slide. And here again, so that was 1947. In 1949, we have something from the Anti-Defamation League. This is an ordinance against anti-masking. The same time that's layered with this KKK welcome sign. So even though these legislations are passing, things really took time to actually shift. And next slide. And so I like to end these talks by speaking to Bess Meyerson, because I think this is also the same era, but it's really an incredible story. So Bess Meyerson was the first and only Jewish Miss America. She was crowned in 1945, so really the tail end of the Holocaust. And when she won, it was really, on the one hand, incredible. On the other hand, 3 of the 5 sponsors pulled out once she won the title because she was Jewish. And so she later teamed up with the Anti-Defamation League to speak out against discrimination and what she faced. And so she would go around the country touring with her speech, which was called "You Can't Be Beautiful and Hate." So So to follow up a little bit, in 1955, that's when we're talking from 1947 to 55. It took that many years for the governor of Florida, Leroy Collins, to sign a bill that forbade discrimination, both in advertising, but across the state. And so really, these are a big part of our story. I think something that kids and people don't realize is that as open and accepting and diverse of a community that Miami is today, this history isn't so far away. And so we use our building, our objects to continue to share these stories and connect them to the present. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Luna, for that. That was amazing history that you just shared and so relevant to everything here in Miami. And it makes me realize like, oh my gosh, I need to go to the museum. So I hope it's doing that for folks who are listening too. Susan, just in a follow-up question to that amazing presentation, why is it important for public universities to have museums like the Jewish Museum of Florida and places like Casa Cuba? Why is it important that they're made available to students and faculty?
Right. So again, thank you, Luna, for the presentation. And I think I just want to make one statement, which is that all life in South Florida changed in the 1980s, in the early 1980s. And that part of Miami Beach became like the center of the cocaine cowboy wars and things like that. And all of the Jews living in that area basically fled. And the synagogue became empty. You know, that's one of the reasons that by the 1990s, they were ready to the idea of turning it over to become a museum. And that's just another important part of the history that we tell at the museum. And this discrimination against Jews on Miami Beach was in conjunction with discrimination against the community of color, even worse, in that there were rules at that time that said any person of color could work on Miami Beach, but had to be off the island by nightfall. Entertainers who performed, major entertainers, you know, Sammy Davis Jr. could perform, but he couldn't stay in the hotel where he performed. So there was huge discrimination. And I grew up in Florida in the 1950s and 60s. And I can tell you from personal experience, there was really no difference between Miami and any southern city that you might want to imagine in your mind, you know, as an image of discrimination. The signage, the buses, the restaurants, all of it. This was really very much part of the South in terms of that culture. I just want to add that to what Luna had to say. The idea of a Jewish museum attached to a public university is very rare. There are only 2 in the entire country. Now, there are Jewish museums attached to Jewish universities. Yeshiva University has a museum. Brandeis University, which is a Jewish-based university, has a museum. The only other Jewish museum connected to a public university is in Berkeley, called the Magnus Collection. And all the other Jewish museums in the country are either individually, you know, they stand on their own, or again, they're connected to a Jewish institution. So we're very unique in this way. And I will tell you that there has been some controversial discussion about it at all levels of the university and the state. The core mission of the museum is not only to show all of the things that have happened to Jews in this state and all of the contributions they've made, but also to make the point that the experience of Jews immigrating from all over the world in every type of practice of Judaism, in every color and but that those experiences parallel the experiences of all the other immigrant groups that have come into the state of Florida. And that it's important that we share our story and that we also make these comparisons to other stories, because they're universal. The experience of coming to a new country, not speaking the language, not eating the food, being discriminated against. This is true of so many other groups, which is why Casa Cuba exists. And to be able to make all of this history available to the students of FIU is a unique opportunity that students will not find at any other, certainly Florida State school. Additionally, the opportunity to have professors like Dr. Orrin Steer and Dr. Tudor Parfit integrate in their knowledge into our museum activities is another fabulous opportunity for our members who are students to get the knowledge of the academics from the university. So my opinion, of course, I'm the director, but I think it's a wonderful thing that this opportunity is available to the students of FIU, who are in particular an international group. Many are from immigrant families, and it's a universal story that we can share. So that's my basic. I see Orrin wants to add. Orrin?
Yeah, I thank you for all that. I mean, first of all, before I forget, Luna, I need to get my hands on a copy of Bess Meyerson Speaks You Can't Be Beautiful and Hate. I think I want to make a bumper sticker out of that. It's just terrific. But in thinking about the things we've been saying, and I want to tie this also back to what Beko was saying before, is, the complex itself of Jewishness, and the question that Erica and Maya started with, is it a religion? Is it a race? Is it an ethnicity? Is it a nationality? And I think the museum and its relationship to the university really speaks to that complex identity and those different facets. And it also, as Susan just put out, I just want to kind of emphasize and echo, I mean, the job of human beings think by comparison. We think by analogy. And the way to move education forward is to shuttle back and forth from the particular to the universal and back again. And we do that in our Jewish lives all the time. But we don't always have an opportunity to kind of pull back the curtain and kind of show that process of negotiating back and forth constantly between the particular and the universal. It happens for me constantly in Holocaust studies and Holocaust education. How do you make the Holocaust relevant while still maintaining its particularity, right? It happens in issues of teaching Jewish history and Jewish culture. It happens all over Miami. Miami itself is filled with these stories of people moving between the particular and the universal. And so I think that this is one of the great strengths of the museum, but also this is one of the things that kind of we bring to the table, speaking from a Jewish perspective in the world of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and kind of world of intersectionality, which is, I've been around a few years, so it's still a new word to me. I don't know what we used to call it, but I think it was about trying to understand that as Jews, we always have multiple points of identity. We're always Jewish, and I think recognizing that is a door to talking about and kind of breaking down the barriers, because right now society, I mean, the barriers are in some cases higher than they've ever been. And I think the only way to break them down is, as Beko was saying before, I mean, in the classroom, in educational settings, get people to work together on projects on just seeing each other, seeing each other's differences and learning about each other's differences. You know, you don't have to love me, but you can respect me, you know, is kind of a good rule of thumb to try to maybe get our world a little bit closer to the ideal of perfection that we all strive for, because it really needs it right now.
Thank you to you both for those comments. I wanted to pause just for a second to highlight in the chat what Maya said, which is to invite any guests who are viewing to please send your questions into the Q&A box. We would be happy to answer those in the last 15 minutes or so of the hour. So at 11:45, we will stop and we'll take those questions. So start thinking of them and throwing them into that Q&A box. Oren, you already started touching on this a little bit, but I wanted to give you the chance to maybe elaborate a bit more. As the university is continuing to move forward with DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, how might Jews respond to recent initiatives to center issues of DEI in not only the university environment, but in society at large?
You know, in addition to what I just said, and I think this echoes very much what Beka was saying earlier, we have to learn not to be defensive. Centering diversity, equity, and inclusion doesn't mean abandoning the particularity of any group identity, whether it be, you know, majority or minority group. We have nothing to fear by highlighting and emphasizing and bringing out voices that have been silenced in the past. We in Jewish history have such a long history of ourselves having experienced that. And just because in some circles, maybe we've achieved a different kind of white majority status, that doesn't mean that we can't activate that long memory of different kinds of experiences and different ways to connect. So I think the most important thing is we have nothing to fear. And in fact, we have something to contribute to the discussion from our own experiences of intersectionality and from our own history. I mean, I always, you know, think of the famous photo of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel marching with Dr. King. You know, like it's become this iconic image, and it's probably been over idealized, but that's a goal, right? That's something we should get back to, something like that and more.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, you know, the museum is actively doing more programming that is inclusive, that talks to diversity. And so we actually had Beko come as a speaker last year for an initiative that we ran all year long with the support of the Greater Miami Jewish Federation. It was a lecture series called Black Lives in a Jewish Context. And so we were really looking to bring in different voices into our community and moving forward, telling these different stories. I want to share a story that I'm really excited about and hoping to realize at some point at the museum. But I was meeting with someone from the historic Ward Rooming House, or also known as Hampton Art Lovers. And they have an incredible director, Christopher Norwood, who was telling me a story about how during World War II, a lot of Jewish refugees were able to come to the United States by being hired by historically Black colleges. And so they would come and teach in historically Black colleges. And I recently found a play about it. So there's a 4-person play around the legacy of this incredible professor who taught at Hampton College and worked with many talented, well-known artists at the time. And so one of the things that I'm hoping to do in the next few years is to produce this play at the museum in partnership with the Historic Ward Rooming House. So these types of community partnerships are also a big way for us to expand our community and grow in ways that sometimes you can't do those things on your own.
Yes, thank you for that additional comment, Luna. I just wanted to again encourage people to drop your questions. We're coming up on about 11:45 when we will start taking those questions. I wanted to highlight something, Warren, that you said, which is, and I know you were talking specifically about Jewish people's, response to DEI initiatives. But there's, also a response that often happens from the majority, which is, and you kind of touched on it just like a little bit, but I wanted to highlight that there is this kind of false narrative that happens that inclusion of minorities is going to somehow take away from the majority. And I think we see that a lot. So I wanted to just throw that out there and see what thoughts are from the panelists, if you have any, about that in particular, around how might we counteract that kind of narrative that continues to kind of falsely be thought of whenever talking about any kind of marginalized community, but in particular around Jewishness and the inclusivity part of the DEI initiatives that get enacted.
I'm happy to chime in. So facts, really just starting with the facts. And it sounds a little kumbaya, but I think that there is space for all of us. There is space for all of us to exist here. So for instance, I accept that, the majority as far as within the Jewish community is Ashkenazi Judaism, but there's space for the Sephardic Jews and for those who don't, there's space for all of us. We are certainly not a threat to the majority community. There is space for all of us. But I think that what it comes back to is there's a fear. There's a real genuine fear. And I think Dr. Steer alluded to it with the white anxiety. I think there's a real fear that they will be replaced. And I think generally, I don't like to, I like to stick to the facts, and I don't like to suggest there's any validity to that. But particularly if I'm working with a group, I like to acknowledge the folks who have that fear, because I find that one way that we can find some common ground is maybe when possible to stop the shaming, blaming, and finger pointing, to acknowledge that these folks feel the way that they do. And in many cases, they're really interested in moving beyond those fears and those blind spots, but they don't know how to do it. And so in those cases, I am very much interested in helping them do that. And I know that some folks, they think it's too much hand-holding, but if we as Jews don't educate them, then who will? I think that I understand that everyone's not doing this for a living, but I think where possible, we do have an obligation, a responsibility to help those who are really interested in learning more in terms of creating more equitable spaces for Jews and other marginalized groups.
I'd like to say something to that. So I mentioned that one of the things that we emphasize at the Jewish Museum is the similar experiences of different immigrant groups moving to the United States. Specifically here, we're dealing with Florida. But I think one of the reasons that is important is because it enables people to take a look back at their own history. And many of the people living in this country, in the United States, are only one or two generations removed from being an immigrant themselves. And they forget that. And I think through what we teach at the museum, we're able to encourage people to think about that. Take a look at your own history and what did your family struggle with, and perhaps become a little bit enlightened through the study of their own immigrant family past.
All right, thank you.
I
So
think
Beko,
I just want to say I just want to say that I think that's a great point because lots of times there's this white anxiety, fear comes from a place. It's almost like it idealizes a past that never really was, and it imagines a kind of racial purity that and historical purity and ethnic purity that never really was. And if you just get people to, the trick is that first step, which Beko, I think you need to be out there teaching all of these groups. But if to get past that first step and just get people to think about where their own family histories, and we discover like a lot of interesting little things and idiosyncrasies, and that will help kind of break down the notion that it's us versus them, and that we really all are, we're more alike than we're different. And so I just wanted to throw that out there because I found that that's what it made me think of. I want to hear what Erica has to say about it.
Well, I was actually going to say, Beko, I appreciate so much that you said that not everybody is going to want to go through the emotional labor of educating other people, that there are people who are called to this work and who are experienced in doing it and are paid to do it and want to do it, and those people are there for communities and individuals who want to learn more. And then I appreciate also what you said about really doing that with people who want to learn because it's exhausting work, especially engaging with people who just really, they're just not there, right? They're not going to want to learn. And I would rather focus on people who are in that state where they might be able to shift a little bit. And that's something that we talk about a lot here in the Office of Social Justice and Inclusion as well, and like where to expend our energy. And also like paying people for their work. So thank you for mentioning both of those things. I don't really have any other solutions to add. I think it is education, and I think it's a little bit of what Susan said with compassion and building compassion in others. And sometimes people are never going to really understand exactly. No one's going to know what it is to be Jewish if they're not Jewish, right? And no one's going to know what it is to be Black. No one's going to know what it is to be gay unless they identify and have experienced that. But everyone can relate to, not feeling like a part of a group or being left out, or right, like those basic kind of human emotions that we all have experienced at one point or another in our lives. And I think if we can build compassion around that and empathy and not just understanding, I think that's a good place to go from. Susan.
Well, I just want to add to some of the things I said before about why FIU should have this Jewish museum. One of the aspects of FIU, and I will tell you, I'm one of the very early alumna of FIU in 1976. So I go way back to when it was 3 buildings and you could just drive right up to your classroom and park. So if you can imagine. But FIU is a place that offers studies in many different groups of people, religions, and we work together. And so I did mention Casa Cuba. I also want to mention the Jaffer Center for Muslim World Studies. These components of FIU give students an opportunity to learn similarities, differences, histories. And I just think it's really important that a public university is offering all of these opportunities to their students and to the community at large.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning the other area that students can access as well. So I want to end our round of planned questions with Beko. If you could reflect a bit on the fact that we have some attendees here who are committed to fundraising and philanthropy. And when we think about inclusive philanthropy, what are some key areas that you think we should be considering related to diversity, equity, inclusion in philanthropy?
Well, first, a shout out to all those working in philanthropy and fundraising. I mean, we need this work, so thank you for all that you're doing. As we all know, philanthropy is important work. It's not selling burgers or widgets. It's really about helping individuals, empowering communities, and really doing all that we can to improve society as a whole. And for that reason, I believe we need to hold ourselves to a higher standard when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so the first thing that comes to mind is representation, right? People need to see themselves. We need to see the individuals in these organizations look like the communities that they're serving. That's, I think, essential. And it's very interesting that right now in the United States, more than 75% of foundation staff identify as white. And that number goes above 80% when you start looking at the CEOs, executive staff, and board members. So there's a lot of room for growth in this area. So I would say representation. So that's definitely a key area. Also with challenging our assumptions about what donors look like, for instance. So I know that, oftentimes you're compiling your list, you're trying to figure out who's a good fit, who believes in the cause, and quite frankly, who's most likely to give money, right, in order to do this good work. And I think in that process, sometimes we can forget that there are individuals out there who don't necessarily fit these traditional donor profiles. And they're often ignored. And I think that happens with a lot of Black and brown people, for instance. I think there's sometimes an assumption that Black and brown people don't give, or maybe they can't give because they don't really have the money to give. So I would encourage those doing this work to kind of look beyond that. And similarly, not to make the assumption because someone is Jewish that they're necessarily in the position to become a donor. I think that that's important to state as well. And finally, committing to this long-term work. I think like so many things in philanthropy, it's important to take a long view, big picture approach. And I think that diversity, equity, inclusion should be treated the same way in philanthropy. I think that right now there's been so much scrambling with organizations trying to figure out how to get this right. And what I can tell you for sure is that it is not a quick fix. It takes time because really what we're talking about is changing culture, changing the culture of the organization and the way things are done. And that takes time. And so I would encourage those doing the work to be patient, be forgiving of yourselves, but inaction is not, it's not an option. You have to keep moving forward, but it should be methodical, well thought out. And that's what I would offer when it comes to DEI and philanthropy. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Deiko, and thank you to all of the panelists. Susan, did you want to add something else?
I did. I have had, you mentioned I had the position before I became the museum director of being the development director for all Jewish strategic initiatives of FIU. That position no longer exists, but my point that I wanted to make about fundraising and at the university is there are people who are interested in some, for lack of a better term, crossover giving. So for example, I've had some very good experiences with people who are interested initially in the Jewish Museum, but then when they find out everything else that's available, they don't withdraw their gift from the Jewish Museum, but now they move on to perhaps give another gift to SIPA or some other part of the organization. And so I would just like to make that point that there may be donors that you're working on for a particular gift who don't know that we have a Jewish museum. And they don't have to be either or. we've seen this work, and I just want to put that out into people's minds, not only for the Jewish Museum, but also Casa Cuba, the Jaffer Center, other components of FIU. I think there are people in the community who can think broadly. So I just want to put that out there.
Really good points. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, everybody on the panel. All of your words were inspiring and motivating and just so interesting, so much history and great perspectives. I appreciate you all so much. I'm going to pass things over to Maya now to cover, I guess we have maybe 3 or so Q&A questions in the box down there, maybe more, but thank you so much.
You all were amazing. Thank you, thank you. Becco, the team is going to be hearing me say inaction is not an option. They are going to be sick of me, but it's okay. So thank you all so much. So one of the questions that we did have, and Oren, you did address this, thank you, but I did want to share and also ask if anybody else wants to contribute. Besides writing down the books mentioned today and visiting the Jewish Museum as examples, what would you recommend would be the best way to learn about more Jewish history, culture, religion, constituents, etc.? As a mom, how is the best way you feel is a good way to teach kids about this? And just so folks know, Oren did provide a link if you guys want to take a look at that and copy and paste. But does anyone else have any?
I have some thoughts. One, thank you for this question. I think it's a great question. And I also want to reference something that Erica had mentioned around, it's important to teach from a place of empathy, because oftentimes it's true that we operate from a place of fear, and that fear can sometimes come from not knowing. So I think encouraging youth to ask questions is always a great place to start. I also want to highlight a program that we had. I'm not sure how old your children are, but we put on a wonderful panel a few months ago, and it was all about inclusive children's literature. And there's an incredible author, Ruth Behar, who works closely with the university. She's based in Michigan, but she wrote a wonderful book called Tia Fortuna's New Home that teaches around Jewish identity, but also Jewish Cuban identity. And it's a fantastic book. We also have on our website a list of resources and children's books for different ages. So I'll try to find that and share it in the chat. But it might be a good place to start. It's not too overwhelming of a list. It's rather short.
I just want to add also, Joan, that Luna organizes family days. And they're usually in conjunction with one of the other museums. So are they sometimes at the Frost?
They are not often at the Frost, actually. Our next one is coming up in August at the historic Hampton House. So again, speaking to our community collaborations, and they're often theme-based. The last one, for instance, the theme was poetry for National Poetry Month. So we're using these different angles to learn about Jewish culture and also have some fun. And you are all welcome to join us.
So I'm going to suggest that if we have access, that we put everyone on our mailing list. We send out a newsletter once a week with all of our activities. And you'll see where we have children's programming and activities throughout the year. That might be a good introductory step for your children.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you all. I do want to thank my colleague, Philip, who I don't think you all can see, but he is there. Philip, thank you so much for collaborating with the Office of Inclusive Philanthropy. We appreciate your work and everything that you do for FIU. So thank you all so much. We'll be sure that you all receive a copy of this session on today. And we look forward to having you all back for the next one. This we'll definitely do a part 2, much needed. So
thank you.
Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.